In 10th grade literature, as most of you know, our curriculum revolves around 3 thematic units: heroes, courage, and human rights. Our presentation today fits well into all 3 categories. I would like to introduce to you Mr. George Aigen of Valdosta and his wife Joyce, who is here as well. Mr. Aigen is a veteran of World War II who helped liberate over 32,000 prisoners from the concentration camp at Dachau. Please give Mr. Aigen your attention, the respect he so rightfully has earned, and a warm Wildcat welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, maybe I should quit while I'm ahead. My name is George Aigen. I was born on October 9th, 1925 in Brooklyn, New York. I spent most of my youth in and around the area I was born in. I graduated from public school 91 on Albany Avenue in New York. I graduated from Samuel J. Tilden High School in 1943. By that time, the war had already been almost 2 years going. The country that I graduated in is nothing like what this country is today, and nothing like probably what you have ever seen in your lifetime. And I'm going to read to you from a book that I picked up, a paragraph, to describe somewhat what the country was like at that time. As the war years passed on, America found itself saying goodbye to its sons and then waiting to say hello. Life moved on, as did the buses and trains that traveled from one end of the country to the other, carrying civilians and servicemen on a horde of war missions. And young women who still live with their parents suddenly moved from home and hearth, some to enlist in the Waves, the WACs, or the Coast Guard spars. Thousands of others to work in defense plants, their way of helping their brothers and cousins and boyfriends. Store shelves went bare as goods, one taken for granted, suddenly disappeared. Packaged cigarettes became a memory, and people took to rolling their own. Americans groused and complained but accepted food rationing, standing in line for butter, sugar, coffee, and shoes. These same Americans hunkered down, driving less to conserve precious gasoline, and willingly turning in their old toothpaste tube when they were buying a new one. Bond rallies and tin can drives and waste paper drives were a weekly occurrence. Housewives salvaged grease from cooking, collected clothing, and anything else that could be used for the war effort on the home front. I graduated, as I said, in 1943 from high school, and I applied and was accepted at New York University as a freshman. In my 17th year, I had another task to complete. I had to sign up with the draft board, or it's called the Selective Service System. And so I went down to the local office on September the 7th of 1943 and signed in. That's a copy of my original draft card, which I'm holding in my hand. You had to keep this card with you all the time, whenever you went out. It was an identification. It proved that you, in my case me, had signed up for the draft. They had guys walking around the streets in pairs with MT on their arm, and military police, and they were armed, sidearm, and they would come up to you on the street just as you were walking by and say, ID. And you had to show this card or your birth certificate or something to prove how old you were. And if you could not produce such a thing, you were going to jail at the spot. I had come in, signed in, as I said, as I showed, on September 7th of '43. I was called to service, and prepared to go to report. And that morning, my father took me in his car, drove downtown Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, and stopped off at a very large building, an armory. I still remember that feeling I got when I came out of the car and looked back at my father. This was September 7th, 44. I looked back at him and realized I might never see him again. I went in the building. It was a very large building, more than big open area at the ground floor and upper floors as well. And the first thing I did, I had to take off my shirt and walk through the aisles, down the hallways, and they were waiting for me. And there were two groups, one on either side. As I went by, they put needles into my shoulder on both sides. And I went into a little open area, and there were two gentlemen sitting there, and I figured out they were doctors because they had those thingamajigs around their neck. And I went over and they put the thingamajigs out and oh yeah, you're fine. Yeah, go. I'm asked how I got into the Army. And that day I got into the Army. Because what happened is I went further down the hallway and then came to a door. On the other side of that door was a large room, almost as large as this one. And there were three groups in the room. And as the door opened and we came out, there must have been well over 100 of us in the building at the time for the purpose. There was somebody by the door, and he would announce as they came, as we went in, Army, Navy, Marines, Army, Navy, Marines, and I was Army. So that put me in the United States Army. That night I wound up at Fort Dix, which was in New Jersey. It is no longer in existence, it's been closed down. Fort Dix at that time was a very large camp, fort. There was also a POE, Port of Embarkation. POE were very big words in those days because it was indicated a port, city, or place in which you went overseas. I went through a few different camps and wound up in a place called Camp Chaffee, which was in Arkansas on the Oklahoma border. Today it's called Fort Chaffee. And that's where I got my training, and I was assigned to Company B, the 1269th Combat Engineers. And I was in the first platoon. And there were 3 platoons and a headquarters platoon for the company. Platoon consisting of about 30 some odd men. We are the guys that built bridges, handled mines and explosives, built roads, and all the other dirty jobs that you might want to have, of course. And also, in our case, acted as infantry. We fell out one morning for attendance, as we do every morning, and they would call off our names, and you say here, or here, or here. And we were told that we were leaving the next morning to go to Fort Dix, P-O-E. And we were going overseas. We boarded a train and rode up to New Jersey, got out, went to this camp, very large camp. Went into a barracks, and then fell out for attendance, which they took, and when it was over, I asked the sergeant, where do you go to eat? Where's the mess hall? And he said, you go down a block, and then 2 blocks, and then you turn right, to the left. And that's what I did, and I wound up in a very big mess hall. That was about the size of this room, maybe bigger. And I took my dish things there, and they would slot the food in like they did, one on top of the other. And I went down to where the tables, so there was long tables with benches alongside, and there were some guys in uniform sitting and eating. And I sat down next to them in the next available place, and I got prepared to eat when somebody sat next to me on my left and put his arm around my shoulder. And I looked up, and it was my Uncle Aigen, my mother's younger brother. He was in his 30s, he was married, had a child, and he'd been drafted. And he had been at Dix the day before me. And he was waiting to go overseas. My favorite uncle. We talked and spent a few hours together and then went our ways. The next morning, I was standing in front of the barracks and they're taking attendance again, as they did every morning. Standing in line, I was at parade rest, which means you cannot move your foot. You can move one leg, not the other. You're sealed to the position. And as I looked up, I saw a group of men passing by with their rifles and their packs. Obviously, they're on the way to the ship. And I got a wave from my Uncle Aigen that he was going overseas. As it turned out, he survived the war and afterwards, and passed away a few years back. We got on the ship the next day. And our ship was a cruise ship, originally. It was called the Mariposa, but it had been converted to a troop ship by taking all the available space and putting it in bunks, 4 high. And I drew one of them. I was on the 3rd high. And that's where I slept for the next, I think it was 8 days. On the 9th we arrived. Okay, George, next. I went through the Straits of Gibraltar and wound up in the Mediterranean Sea, and we docked at night just east of the city of Marseille in France, all German-held territory. We got off the ship at night. There was nobody else around, I was glad to say. And we emptied out onto an open field. It must have rained there recently because the ground was soft a little bit, and some tanks must have gone through and they made that heavy indentation of the tracks in the dirt. And I was looking for a place to spend the night. And I got down into one of those treads where the indentation was, and I put my rifle across my chest, and I spent the night that way, figuring that any bullets were flying, at least I had a little chance of going over me instead of in. We worked our way east from Marseille to the French border town of Saspel. Saspel was a small town, it's a little black circle there, right off the coast of Italy, which of course again was held by the Germans. We were in a very nice chateau in Saspel with a beautiful building. It had a fountain in the front, sprinkling water. The only trouble was that the far side of the chateau faced the German lines. But there were trees all around, so that's what saved us, and probably in selecting this place. The trees covered the movement of our trucks. And it was on the far side of the town, which made it about a half-mile walk, and out in the open. And we used to have a lot of fun then because the German artillery 88s would try to get us when we were walking up and back on the road every day. We learned to whistle through the whistles. We were working up in the foothills of the Alps there, which is where this was. And after about 2 months, we received word that we were leaving because they had an emergency up north of us in the Belgium-French area. It was called the Battle of the Bulge. You may have heard about it or read about it. The Germans had made a big drive into Belgium, and they needed every troop they could get to help drive them back out. So we got in our trucks and we started to go north. Took us about 2.5 days to get there. And when we did, by the time we did, we found out that the battle had been over. The Germans had retreated, which we were not sorry to hear. We were in the town of Nancy, the city of Nancy, I should say. And it is on the northeast corner of France. And my colonel called us all into a movie house one day. And he took the stage and told us in no uncertain terms, walking up and back, that we would be going to Germany tomorrow. And that our goal would be the city of Munich. Now, Munich was the second largest city, it still is the second largest city in Germany. And it was the birthplace of the Nazi Party. That is where they originated from. And that's the third ring up there. And so, the next day, we took off and started our trip. We went through many towns in Germany. I can't even remember the names anymore, or they just mean names to me. But then we reached a place called Friedrichshafen. Now, Friedrichshafen was like a subsidy of the city of Mannheim, and what separated it was the Rhine River, one to the other. And in Friedrichshafen, we were attached to a group called the 711 Combat Group. Now, you probably never heard of them, because I hadn't heard of them until then. I was in the Army. But they were a special group. There were 3 of these groups in the Army. One was in the Pacific, one was in North Germany, and one was down where we were. And what it was, they were made up of about 25 or so officers from all the Allied forces. In other words, they were Russian officers, Polish officers, French officers, British, even a few American officers. But they were special officers. They were not troops. They were technicians, engineers, and such. And their job was to ferret out from the German information that we came across, ferret out information, engineering or whatever, that might help us in our fight against Germany. As a first job, a first target, we were to go to a Mercedes-Benz factory in Mannheim. They wanted to study the procedure of the trucks that the Germans were building in the factory, and they were building German Army trucks. We tried to cross the Rhine on 3 occasions, so it took us the 3rd time to get over. We were being shelled and bombed from the others. And we finally got into the streets of Mannheim and worked our way through and came to this Mercedes-Benz factory. And it was a big building, a full block long and a block wide. And it had a concrete wall about 8 or 9 feet around the entire block. And there was only one entrance, which was great for us. We went into the factory, and it was a 2-story building. There was a big open floor, and then there was the top floor where the offices, etc., were situated. And on that floor, if you look down to it, you could see the assembly line in a horseshoe area. They'd start with a frame of a truck, and they would move it along the length of the block, adding to it as it went, and then it would make the turn, come back down the other side, and when it was finished, it was a full, complete German Army truck, and they would drive it off. They got their what they wanted, that is, to study the line. We had nothing to do but put 2 men on the gate, on guard duty, which we did, on and off, and we had 30 guys to break that down, so we had plenty of time to do nothing. So I said to the guys, let's go up to the office and see what's doing up there. And we went up there, about 5 of us, and we went in, opened the door, and there was the office. Desks, chairs, lamps, and nothing else. Not even a scrap of paper. Even the wastebaskets were empty. So we walked in, looked around, empty, empty. But then on the back wall, we noticed this big thing outlined on the wall, about 8 feet high and about 4 or 5 feet wide, a door into the wall, metal, smelled of a safe. And we loved safes, because we had all kinds of explosives that we used, right in our truck. And I had the truck that had the explosives. We used to sleep on it. We had an explosive at that time, it was called C2, Composition 2. It was like clay. You could pick it up, mash it up, break it apart, throw it down, step on it, hammer it, nothing would happen. Until you put in the cap and then a fuse. And you lit the fuse and blew the cap, and that blew the C2. And so we took this C2 and outlined it in the door on all three sides, the two sides and the top. And we put the cap in, put the fuse in, lit it, and went outside the office. And there was the boom, and the door just clocked down on the floor. And we ran in to see what was in there, and it was a big empty safe. Except for one thing. In the far end, against the wall, all the way in, was a big wicker basket full of paper envelopes. We had found the payroll for the factory. And so we pulled it out on the floor and sat around in a circle, having nothing else to do. And we took the envelope and it was, all right, let's see what Herman Muller made this week. Oh boy, 185 marks. I'd take them out, throw them on a pile, and then put the coins on the other pile. And pretty soon, when we got down to the end, and it took a while to do that, we had a pile of marks that was about 3 feet high almost, and almost as many on the coins. Then came the other question, what are we going to do with it? Now, this was a war area. I have never seen in my entire trip overseas in Germany, never saw a store that was open. All the banks were flat, blasted. And there was no place that I knew of to spend the money. And besides which, if we tried to, it would be illegal. So one of the guys says, let's burn it. And I said, no, wait a minute. And I went out, I got a copy of the Stars and Stripes, which is the Army newspaper. It's about the size of the Valdosta Times. And I brought it in, opened it up on the floor, and shoveled a bunch of marks from the pile into it, filled it up pretty good. And then I rolled it all up and stuck it under my arm and just walked out and let it go. I don't know what they did with the rest.
We have about 2 minutes till lunch.
Thank you. We left Mannheim after about 2 days. And we left on our own because we were separated from the 7-Eleven group. We had our target to get to. And we went through a whole bunch of towns, as I said. And knowing these towns, driving down the roads, you had to be very careful because you'd come to a fork in the road and the sign would say, Mosbach that way, and this way. But you know, you never trusted them because what they did is they would often change the sign direction, or else they would take the signs out altogether. And so we would go into towns we didn't even know the names of, and what have you. And we had to watch out on the forks, but we knew we had to go east, and so we would aim in that direction for the most part, and go that way east when we were going towards Munich. As we went along, we came to a town which was a little unusual. And we decided to stop there. It's called Heilbronn, but I'm going to leave it there and let you do your break. And we'll pick up Heilbronn afterwards. We left the program before, and then we come to the town of Heilbronn. Heilbronn was a very interesting place. It was very old in the area that we were habited. center of the town was an area about 2 blocks long and about 1.5 blocks wide. And it had a wall around it, a 20-foot wall, concrete. And there was one gate. We went through the gate, and on the left-hand side were buildings, homes. They were built right into the wall. The back of the home was up against the wall. There was a flight of stairs, and they would go into the 2nd floor. House after house after house. In the center was a cathedral. Beautiful looking place. I went in there just to look around, and I walked in and I was overwhelmed in a way. The whole center, the Germans had cleared out the whole center and taken all the chairs, all the seats, and pushed them up flat against the wall. And they brought in machinery to make bullets for the army. I looked through the place, and I found in a corner, it looked like engravings in the floor. And I cleared some of the debris, and I found what looked like a plate. To me, it looked like a plate for a burial. And the name was engraved in Latin, but the date, the year, was 947. I was very impressed with that. I went back into the house. And in the house, we had a room. It was 2 bedrooms, a dining room with a long dining room table with a potbelly stove, and a kitchen. It was an apartment, and we would be billeted there for a couple of days. The owner of the apartment was an elderly German woman. She looked to be in her 60s, and she was very nervous and fluttery. But we assured her that we'd take care of everything, we wouldn't damage anything, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And finally, she left to go back into the town to sleep and spend the time with her daughter and her son-in-law. We were getting a little tired, it started to get dark outside, and it started to get cool. And one of the guys said, "There's a pot-belly stove, let's build a fire." So we went out and scrounged up some wood and paper and put it into the stove, lit it up, and it got very nice and warm and cozy. And we decided to go to sleep, knock it off. We hadn't seen a bed in I don't know when. The next morning, early, we were up, and the landlady came in. And she started to look around, etc. And then started screaming at the top of her lungs in German. And of course, we didn't know what the heck she was screaming about. So I said to one of the guys, "Go get Nader." Now, Sergeant Nader was a Brooklyn boy, but he was in German parentage, and he was our interpreter for our group. And so we dug him up and got him to come in, and he came in and he spoke to the woman, and he started laughing. So I knew it was no good. What happened? Well, it seems her friends had told her that the American soldiers would clean her out. They would take all the stuff that was worth anything and take it out, and she would never see it again, and all that. So she had to hide whatever she thought was valuable, and she hid her money in the stove that we burned. We burned her entire fortune, whatever she had. She didn't have a dime. I said, don't worry, not to worry. I went over and I got my roll and brought it in, put it on the dining room table and flipped it, and it unrolled down, and the marks got flying out from all sides. And her eyes start flying out. She had never seen anything like this in her life. I asked her, how much money did you have? And of course, I don't remember what she said. Say 200 marks. I said, good, I'll give you 400. And I counted it all out, and I gave it to her, and her eyes again almost popped out of her head. But I guess she feel a little bit better about American troops. 2 days later, we left and continued on our march to Munich. We arrived in Munich at night. It was dark. It was April 28, 1945. We came into the streets. The street lights were on, but there was nothing else alive that we could see. Not a soul, not a person, nothing. Houses, all dark. Not a car, nothing. Down the block, there seemed to be a fairly sized building, so we went over there and walked up the steps and into the building, and we realized immediately we were in a museum. With the marble floors, and I had a staircase going up to a platform and a marble platform area. I went up the steps, I lay down on the platform and went to sleep. I was dead tired. The next morning they woke us up early and said they had a new assignment for us. We were going to the concentration camp of Dachau. It was 8 miles northeast of Munich. And although we wouldn't be the first one in, there was a unit from the 3rd Infantry Division which would be the first in. And we were to be their rear guard, make sure that no Germans came around behind them once they were in the camp. So we would be about 5 minutes behind. We got into trucks, drove out to the camp, and they let us out of an area where there was a big open space, and you could see the camp up on the hill, up above. The wall was up with the barbed wire and the central posts. Problem was that we didn't know what was up there. We knew that the 3rd Infantry had gone in. There were no shots being fired that we could hear, but we had no idea of what had happened before we got there. And we were standing in an open field like dead ducks in a row, walking towards the gate. As we walked, I noticed that there was a single-track railroad that was running up the side of the area and up in and through the gate into the camp. We went through the gate, and the gate has this particular sign, Arbeit macht frei, which means work will make you free. Now, Dachau was built in 1933. It was the first camp built in Germany, and it was the basis of all the other camps that were built. And there were over 200 camps in Europe. Some big, some small. That sign was over the entranceway to every camp. The inside, well, let me put it this way. But strange things happened some years after the war. Adolf Hitler's photographer decided to take a vacation and go out and take pictures of his adventures in Germany or whatever. And one of the stops he made was at Dachau, and he took a group of pictures. This is a picture he took of the wall and the sentinel post in the distance. I have a few of them that were given to me. And there I was at the gate, going through, ready to go through. And as I walked through that gate, I was like walking through a wall of air. The stink was overwhelming. It was so bad that when we got through the gate, 3 or 4 of the guys in my group had to take out their gas masks and put them on. They couldn't stand the smell. This is a sentinel post that was at the camp. Now, Dachau was a concentration camp. Now, how did it get to be called concentration, and why? Because you concentrated all your enemies in one place so that you could deal with them. That's how concentration camp, the word, came to life. As we came into the open area, there was a line of trees on the right-hand side, and there were a few bodies of prisoners, about 3 or 4 of them, lying on the grass, dead. You could tell they were prisoners because they were wearing the black and white 2-piece uniforms, the jacket and the pants, with the black stripes. On the left-hand side, where the railroad track ran up into the deeper part of the camp, there was a train of boxcars on that track. All the doors had been opened, and you could see that there were people, bodies inside. In fact, on the car that was nearest to me, there was a woman that was hanging halfway out of the door with her arm hanging down her head, and you could see part of the shoulder, and she was dead. And so was everybody else on the train, men, women, and children. 2,310 who had starved to death on the train. I walked a little further into the camp, and this is a picture of the street with the barracks lining up all the way down as far as you can see. I went up to the first barrack, go next, sorry, and opened the door on the barracks. And then if you look at this picture, you'll notice on the left-hand side, there is a door. And I walked through that door. And as someone once said to me at one of my talks, that's probably the first American soldier to go through that door, and probably right. Now, these barracks, prisoner barracks, were kept enclosed completely. Even the windows had barbed wire over them, but they also had cloths over the windows so that no light would penetrate inside the barracks. I opened the door, and when I did, the light from outside came into the barrack, and I could see the front end of the barrack. By the way, go to the next one, Joyce. This is a photo of American troops walking through the streets with barracks on either side, black and white. Do the next one now. This is a picture of the actual Dachau camp shortly after it was liberated. And there was some of the prisoners sticking their heads through the windows and through the barbed wire. And this is a picture of the inside of the camp, of the building. Now, when I opened the door, the light shined on the front end of the cots. By the way, the pillows and the mattresses were all stuffed with straw. Inside, there were about 800 prisoners. The building had been built to originally accommodate about 160. They were jammed in wall to wall, stealing the body. There was practically no place to walk. But as I was standing there with the light on, right in the front row of the cots, at the top, one of the prisoners reached over on his elbow to look down at me. No one else even moved. I looked up at him, and if you ever saw a skeleton with skin on it, that would be it. He lasted about 5 or 6 seconds and then just fell back in exhaustion. Next one first. This is what some of those people looked like at the camp. These were the walking ones. I knew there was nothing I could do for them because all I had was a canteen of half full of water. And besides which, I'd known, looking back, that the medics were already coming into the camp itself and helping the people who needed help. One of the barracks, by the way, was inhabited by a group of clergy. There were 120 of them in the barrack, of all denominations. Some that I'd never even heard of, but anyway, they were there and we released them and they came out to help on the prisoners as well. I moved on and I found an open space. And this is what I called the swing set. I lived in Long Island for a while with my wife and my 3 children. And on the side, in the grass area, we had what I call the swing set. You know what it is, the pipe area that comes up with a cross and the chains come down and there swings. And the kids would go out in there and spend some time in the afternoon playing and swinging. That's what this represented to me. Only instead of having the swings, it was a rope with a lariat at the end. And what they would do is they would go down into the prisoner camp itself, the barracks, and select a prisoner and bring him back, make him come back to here, and then they would tie the rope around his waist under his arms and let him hang. And then they take that bat that he's holding and whack the hell out of him until they just got tired of it. In which case then they would take the rope from around and put it around his neck and hang him. By the way, that picture you see came from the records in the office. went further, and I came to another building called the Browse Bed, the shower room. And this is the door to it. Now, these people that were being brought here were on the train sometime for weeks, just like the group that was at the gate who died because they didn't have food while they were on the train. But what they were told here was that take off your clothes, lay it neatly on the side so it'll be there when you come out, and we'll give you a shower, you get all cleaned off, and you'll feel better, whatever. And they would put people in the shower, maybe 100 and 120 or so at a time. And this is the picture of the inside of the shower. You can see the spigots in the roof, and notice the windows are very solid, and the wall is as well, because it wasn't for showers, but gas that came out. And everybody in that room was killed, gassed. And then they would take them and take them over to the ovens and take their clothes and take storage in the warehouse. And in the warehouse, it was sectioned off. There was the shoes, the pants, the shirts, the dresses, and so on. All had their own bins. And the next picture is an actual oven, or two. And you can see some material is in it. And it wasn't just firewood. And on the right side, you'll see two bodies of women, both dead, waiting their turn to go into the ovens. And that they did a lot of. And as a matter of fact, can you go back, Joyce? Okay. Go back to the previous picture of the swing set. If you look at the lower right-hand corner under the swing, you see that pile there. That's human ash that came out of the ovens. They saved it, and they piled it and put it in a box, which I'll show you in a moment. And then what happened is people from the town would come and take the ash and take it and put it on their fields and use it as a fertilizer for their crops. And as a matter of fact, the next picture is, as you can see, ashes were stored in this box. The next is a memorial. By the way, these two pictures, the last two, were taken by it was photographer. This is a memorial dedicated, as the stone says, a grave of the thousands of unknowns who died there. I should have said hundreds of thousands who died there. And then we have a photo, the black and white, that someone gave me, Marvin, of American soldiers viewing the body of dead prisoners at Ordor. Now keep in mind also, I might as well go to, the Germans didn't think of the prisoners as people. They thought of them as pigs. In fact, there were photos hung up on the wall, drawings, which showed German soldiers sitting on the back of people with pig heads. And people were wearing the black and white striped uniforms that the prisoners wore, and they were beating them with their whips. In fact, even in the literature, in the office of the camp, they would say that 2,000 pigs died this week. refer to them in other ways as pigs. The next is a list of the people, survey of internees at Dachau concentration camp by nationality. I want to point out that there were 41 different nationalities in that camp. 41. The 42nd were Jews. There were only 2,539 Jews there. And there were 31,432 in the camp, which meant there were 29,000 who were not Jews in that camp, who were part of concentration, concentrating their enemies. The Nazis had a lot of enemies. I was at the camp for 2 days, doing what little I could, really. As it turned out, when General Eisenhower heard what was going on at the camps, he froze them, and he ordered that they not be moved, anything, be moved in or out. And he came down and looked at several of them, and he came down and told them to get the German civilians to bury the dead. And so the people from the town had to come to the camp and dig a grave for the prisoners that were dead. Now remember, I spoke, I think, to remind you that I'm covering a 2-year period. I left the camp, as I said, and 2 days later. We went back to the war. And one day, some time later on, my lieutenant called me in and he said, "I have a job for you." And he handed me a clipboard with papers on it. And he said, "I want you to go to Fontainebleau, France, pick up whatever is on the board, on the clipboard, and bring it back. I'll give you a truck to do it with." I said, "I can't drive a truck." He said, "Why not?" I said, "I come from New York City, New York, and you have to be 21 to drive." And I was only 19. 19-year-old corporal. But he said, "I'll give you a driver. Go get it done." And so that's what I did. The next morning, got in the truck with my driver, and we drove back to France, to Fontainebleau, which was about 40 miles south of Paris. When we got there, we searched down the warehouse, pulled up in front of it. I got out and went inside. The sergeant was sitting by the door with his desk, and I gave him the clipboard. He had to pick us up. He flipped the pages, looked up and said, "We don't have it yet." I said, "When do you expect it?" He says, "Maybe tomorrow or the day after, or whatever." I realized that I would be spending the night in Fontainebleau. So I went back out, and I told the driver, "Look, this is what the story is. Go down to the barracks, get yourself a cot to sleep on, and get one for me, and I'll meet you there later." And he took the truck and went down, and I decided to take a walk. Now, it was very interesting, and it still strikes me as unusual, but in France, when we walked through the streets in uniform like we were, such as what you see, the French, very often, there would be somebody in the group with a camera, and believe me, there weren't a lot of cameras available in those days. And they would willingly take pictures of it. Hey, you want me to take your picture? Take your picture. They may not know very many other words, but they knew those words. I'll take your picture. And what we would do is pose, they would take the picture, and they'd give the picture to us. And I have about a dozen of them in my collection at home. As a matter of fact, this is one of them. And so he took this picture of me walking the streets in Valdosta. And then I walked a little further and came to a beautiful block. On both sides were private homes, two-story high. In the front with a little plot of green grass around it, and a gate, and a little high, a low wall fence. And it just struck me, it's so nice, what a street that anyway would have, a couple of trees. And as I was standing there admiring it, a church bell started to ring. And I said, but this is unusual. It's not Sunday or anything. And then another bell, and another bell, and another bell. And before I knew it, a window opened across the street, and a Frenchman stuck his head out, and he yelled out loud, "La guerre est finie." The war is over. That stopped me dead in my tracks. Here I was out in the middle of, to me, no place, and all my guys were back there in Germany, and they're probably celebrating, and I didn't have anything to do with it. I couldn't be involved in it. Just then, about 2 houses down, a door opened, and a little girl, looked to be 9 or 10 years old, came out, closed the door, and came down the steps, opened the gate, and turned around and started to walk towards me. But like a little girl walks, you know, bouncing along. And she came right up to me and stopped in front of me and took my hand and kissed it, looked up at me and said, "Merci, thank you." I still get a charge when I say that. And she turned around, walked, did a skip, back, went through the gate, went up, closed the door. I never saw her again. Everything was stopped, and I caught a boxcar train under orders. It took me a couple of days, but I was told that the unit was going to be in Brussels, in Antwerp, Belgium. And there was a Camp Top Hat, it was called, and wait to go back to the United States. Our orders said that we would be going back to the States on the ship that was in the dock, and we would get a 30-day leave, and then we would be shipped to California, and then go to the Pacific. So I got on the train, and we were going along the German countryside. And I made a couple of German farmers rich by taking that roll that I had and emptying all the marks and let it blow out into the fields. And they came running, I could see them, as we were going, to pick up all the marks they could. And this final picture is a picture of the 1269th Combat Battalion, August of 1945, at the dock at Antwerp, Belgium, boarding a troop ship for the voyage home. It was a 10,000-ton Victory ship. I could say also that it was one of the biggest gambling ships probably ever, because we had never been paid a day we were overseas. And what happened is a lieutenant came on board one day with two MPs to guard him, and he had a pile of money, freshly printed. In fact, the ink was coming off on his fingers, and he had to dip it into a cup in order to wipe the ink off. And we stood there, or rather, he stood there, sat, and the two guards sat next to him, and the whole ship, all our soldiers were called one by one to come through and get money. We didn't get the entire pay that they owed us, but we did get, I think it was a $200 down payment. And the crap games and the card games that went on at night, all night long on the ship, were endless. About 3 or 4 years ago, my wife and I made a trip to Washington, D.C. And while we were there, of course, we went to visit the World War II monument. I recommend it to you. It's very beautiful. It has 50 posts. You can see them along the top. Each one represents one of the states of the Union. There is a post marked Georgia. And while we were there, I was told to go down to the end that there was a computer there that would be interesting. And I went down toward that particular gate, and there, sure enough, was a computer, and it gave instructions, and what I did is I typed in my name, George Aigen, and that was what came out. World War II honoree, World War II veteran, Georgia, branch of service, U.S. Army, hometown, Brooklyn, New York. Activity during World War II, served in the European theater, received the European, African, Middle Eastern Medal, American Victory Medal, and 2 battle stars. And also, I might add that we were recognized, my unit was recognized twice by the War Department. Now, the War Department doesn't exist anymore. It became known as Department of Defense. They thought that was better wording for a department of the United States government. Not a department to make war, but to defend the country. I was recognized, we were recognized twice. Once for being the first troops into Munich, among the first troops. And the second time for having spent 180 consecutive days in the war zone. And that, I'm told, was a record. I might add that the total U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, in a country that had about half the population that exists here today, the total U.S. Armed Forces then was 14 million men and women. And if my memory serves me correctly, there was 60,000 casualties in the war. Any questions? If somebody wants to ask a question, please yell out or something. I can't see you.
Have a mic if you want to ask a question.
Oh, you have a mic.
Hold the mic.
No questions? I told such a good story. My goodness.
Well, if there are no questions, I'd like to tell 1 or 2 little stories.
Use the microphone.
Yeah, let's get started.
What are you telling?
Because nobody wants to start with a question. I'm Joyce Aigen. I'm the other half. We have, in fact, I spoke to one of my grandchildren during the break, and she said, make sure that I mention that we're the grandparents of Heather, Haley, and Hope Hathcock, because she says she has friends here. So I I said it. She'll be happy. But what I want to tell you is, George had mentioned that for 60 years he did not speak about his experiences. And Dr. Louis Schmier from VSU had asked him once if he would talk to his history group about it about 10 years ago, which he did. And from that time, this is the 68th and 69th time he is telling civic organizations, groups like yourself, and whoever wants to hear it. But what I also want to tell you is that he mentioned the fact that he went overseas on the Mariposa, which used to be a cruise ship, and it was converted to a transport, you know, during World War II. Well, many years later, I married him about 6, 7 years after he came out of the Army, and my sister-in-law and brother-in-law were going to take a cruise out of New York City, and the ship was the Homeric. And at that time, you didn't worry about the security, and what they did is they let you on the ship as a guest. You went into their stateroom, you had champagne, and they had all kinds of fun. And we go on the ship, we're not into the ship itself except for just a few feet, and he says to me, Joyce, I have been on this ship before. And I said, how could that possibly be? He says, I have been on this ship. He said, this is the Mariposa. And we said, I mean, don't forget that was a troop ship when he went over with bunks. This is a cruise ship with the chandeliers and everything. So we go up to the ship's captain, wherever, that they have a plaque. And sure enough, that was the ship he went overseas on. But the fact that he had that feeling that he was on the same ship. And little incidences like that do happen. So, and then one other thing, April 17th, we are going to the state capitol, Georgia State Capitol, where they're going to have a witness to the liberators 70 years later, because it's 70 years since he liberated Dachau, and he's going to be honored to light one of 6 candles at the rotunda at the state capitol. It's the 2nd time. So I just want to give you a few little background. And now, are there any questions that you have that you want to ask him about the war, about his service, and what's happening now? Thank you.
Wait a minute, we're blowing horns. I must add something else that you didn't say. I've been invited and accepted at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and they will be entering my history there and make it available.
I was wondering if you've been back to Dachau.
Who is it? Here. Oh. Yeah. What about it?
Have you been back there since?
No. No. I've talked to a few people I've had. It's interesting because I spoke to somebody just last week who had made a trip there fairly recently. It was a big camp. But then I was told by someone who came there that, and I read a little blurb about it, that the camp had been cut down to where there was only one building, and they had turned that building into a museum. And I was very disappointed about that. But now I spoke to this other person last week, and she said that she had been there, I think it's 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And she said that there were buildings there, and many more buildings. So I guess they put them back up again or whatever. I don't know. But I've never gone back there, no.
I know you said that you were in the troops that brought up the rear. That
You're too close to the microphone. But
What happened to the Germans who were there?
what?
What happened to the Germans, to the Nazis? Had they abandoned the camp?
Yes,
Or were they-
for the most part, they did. In some areas up on the northern end of the camp, there were some guards still there, and there was some shooting, but not very much at all. It was not a very big time from that period when Germany surrendered. We were once on our trip going to Munich. We reached an area which was near the Alps mountains, foothills. It was very hilly and mountainous. And it was snow on the ground, it was cold, and there was a farmhouse there. We stopped at the farmhouse at night, excuse me, to spend the night. And I, lucky me, got pulled for guard duty. And I and the other two guys were outside in the cold. And we were standing around, and it was so cold, we decided to build a fire. And we built the fire out of there was a lot of wood laying around. In fact, there were woods about 100 yards away. And we were warming our hands on the fire, and suddenly we saw a person coming, and he was in uniform, but not carrying anything, just walking. He had a pack on his back, that's all. And he walked up to the fire, and the neighbor asked him what he's doing there. He said he's freezing, he wants to get warm. All right, then 3 more came out, and 5 more came out. And pretty soon we had about 50, 60 German soldiers who had thrown away their guns, who came to get warm at the fire. They were freezing to death. They had been hiding in the woods. And we had to call the MPs by radio and get them to come down with trucks to take these guys away. And by the time they did, there was a good 5 truckloads of prisoners to get on the truck. So they didn't like it at all, the MPs, because now they had to feed these guys and keep them warm. But that's it. Another little story out of Dachau, Germany.
We have another question over here.
Does it affect you at night, seeing all those dead bodies?
Didn't get it.
Does it affect you at night seeing all those dead bodies?
Well, the war is made up of dead bodies. Some of them guys you know. It's a given. And really, I think we killed, I should say, I think there were more dead bodies of civilians than there were of army people, because the civilians were in the middle. And when they bombed, they really couldn't know where the bomb was landing exactly, and who would be affected by it exactly. But what your idea of the war is, when you're a soldier, is to make sure as much as you can that you're not one of the dead bodies.
Hey, I got a question. Hey, what kind of...
What?
What kind of gun you had?
What kind of a what?
Gun you had?
Gun? Oh, no. I had a Garand rifle, gas operated, 8 rounds and 1 in the chamber made 9. Very good weapon. You could fire it at 100 yards. You're not listening. You would fire it at 100 yards, it would go through a 30-inch tree and come out the other side. It was, I love that gun, that's one thing. It was great. I hate to give it up when I left. That was my weapon.
What was the most moving thing you witnessed during your time, or during your tour?
Give me a translation.
what was the most emotional thing you saw, or what moved you the most? Like, what touched your soul the most out of everything that you saw?
I need a translation. I'm not picking up words.
What was the most moving thing you saw? What was the most emotional experience?
There was, well, look, that whole camp was an emotion. 31,000 some odd people. When I stopped to consider that they were doing business for 12 years, and they were doing all this stuff for 12 years. I'll give you one more story. They had a building there which was reserved for medical experiments. And in that building, they had no prisoners. They had officers and doctors. Now, they had a problem with the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, because they were sending planes into England every day and bombing them. And of course, the planes were being shot down, some of them. And of course, they would shoot down some of the British planes. But the point was that they were losing the planes, and the crews were coming down in the straits. And the straits there, the water between England and France, was very, very cold. All during the year, it never warmed. It was always very cold. And when their pilots came down in their planes and were waiting to be picked up by the German boats that were scattering around, they would freeze and die. And so what they were doing is they brought a large vat into that barrack. They filled it with water and chilled it to the temperature of the straits. And then they pick up 3 or 4 prisoners, bring them into the barracks, and put some clothes on them and throw them into the vat. And then they would time them, how long they lasted before they died. And then they would try other clothes, bring in another 3 prisoners and throw them into the vat, etc. And this went on for several months, with different kinds of approaches. Next.
Well, I just wanted to answer one of the questions that was asked, how his emotional feeling has been. Let's just say for about 60 years after he came home, he never spoke about it. When he started to talk about it about 10 years ago when he was asked, my children, who are adults and parents, said, well, I never heard the stories. Well, the problem was most people didn't ask, what did you do during the war? I mean, most of your parents or grandparents would be in that situation. So then when he did start to talk, he was at some of the schools, and suddenly he turned to me after the program and said, Joyce, I cannot do this anymore. He says, I'm lost in the concentration camp. When he talks about the concentration camp, he sees the concentration camp. And he said, I cannot do this anymore. And I said, well, do whatever you can and stop. Well, we came home and read in the magazine that the Holocaust never happened. And I said, that's your answer. You have to talk. And this is why he has continued. We can't get anybody else to do it because it's very difficult. And when you say emotion, it's 70 years later, and it's embedded in him. It's not an everyday like the wars today, but it's there. And it never leaves. And he does not want to go back to Dachau. He does not want to read books about the concentration camps. He just can't. And I think somebody else has a question.
She's a smart girl.
Alright, so are you still friends with like all of your army buddies from whenever you were in Germany and France?
Translation.
Are you still friends with any of your army buddies?
Yeah, one in particular, Normie Brett. He was the bugler in our outfit, and we used to hang together.
Can we thank Mr. Aigen because it's almost time to go back to
Thank you. Appreciate that.